Hi there. So, talking about the Neolithic Revolution, as pointed out by Jared Diamond, the invention of farming was mankind's greatest mistake. Let's change that to humankind's greatest mistake. And as he pointed out, he thought that dietary issues that played a significant role in shaping human stature. It posed a problem for us, and he challenged a lot of the ideas that existed prior to him publishing that paper. Now, I think what's really interesting about the Neolithic Revolution, at least from a medical anthropological perspective, and this is my area of anthropology, has always been on epidemic disease and medicine, is tracing the emergence of a lot of these new diseases that have affected us historically and continue to affect us to this day. So the Neolithic Revolution, it is pretty much single-handedly responsible for the majority of diseases that we continue to experience today. Let's move on to the next slide. I had referred to the first epidemiological transition. I didn't really give you a chance to write down a definition. Here I will. So, the first epidemiological transition, it refers to this event where infectious disease became the major cause of death among humans for the very first time in human history. As a definition, we could say infectious disease has become the major source of human morbidity and mortality. Morbidity refers to the distribution of illness, and mortality refers to deaths or fatalities. Now, what's interesting about this, I had made that connection to keeping animals. 61% of diseases are derived from animals. We refer to it as zoonotic disease. So approximately, there's 1,400 and I think about 16 diseases that impact us. 61% of those are derived from animals. That's pretty significant. And this is also the case if we look at modern times, for example, the coronavirus. So let's take a look at SARS-CoV-2 or the virus that's responsible for COVID-19. Here's a few facts about it to illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, this disease didn't come from absolutely nowhere. It spilled over, one of the terms that we use, it spilled over from an animal reservoir or an animal that this disease lives in normally. In some situations, it could make the animal sick. In other situations, for example, bats, they just regularly carry these coronaviruses. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it emerges in bat reservoirs. And we knew about this in about 2007. So in China, from the Yunnan province in the caves, they had gathered some feces of a bat, and they refer to it as RATG13, and that was recovered in about 2007. And that's the actual closest virus to the one that's currently circulating. So we know genetically this is an ancestor to it. There's no question about that. And this virus comes from bats. How did it get to human? Well, it could have been either a direct spillover or perhaps more likely it got to us through an intermediate species, an anteater, or what's referred to as a pangolin. Now, the research here, it's not conclusive. People continue to inquire into whether or not there is an intermediate species or was it a result of a direct spillover event. So there's a variety of ways that we can contract these diseases, and generally speaking, it's environments where we're mixing genetic material. We've come into contact with saliva, blood, all of that type of stuff, or just haven't cooked an animal well enough. For example, with H1N1, one of the concerns people had was, could I get the flu H1N1 from eating improperly cooked pork? And the CDC's response was, absolutely, you can. So we have a number of animals involved here, but the other really interesting thing is when we start to keep animals together, closely confined, different animals, there's a potential for the germs or the viruses, the bacteria that they carry to engage in something that we refer to as recombination. So recombination, what that means is a virus has decided to, not so much decided, but it has, uh, they've traded off genetic material. So some of the coronavirus that might be in a pig, for example, is recombined with some of the coronavirus that's in a bat. And we've seen this in a number of places around the world where we really do have improper animal segregation, or we're mixing animals that can create potentially deadly situations. This is the case with the invention of farming and animal husbandry, or the domestication of animals. Let's move on to the next slide. So what begins to happen now over time is we start to see a lot of disease emerge as a result of a lot of the adaptations and developments that are taking place in our societies. So we have a change in the way that we live. We're nomadic, no longer nomadic. We no longer leave our waste behind. We've become sedentary. So we have all of those hygiene issues to deal with. In addition, population, that begins to increase. And with populations increasing, we always have a fresh new host for an infectious organism. For example, measles, there's a threshold. People have studied this and they say populations that are under 400,000, measles is going to die out. So it wasn't until populations became high enough, that 400,000 mark, that measles, which is highly infectious, was able to become endemic and always circulate within the population. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, we see some images. These are archaeological artifacts, bioarchaeological artifacts that tell us a little bit about what else is taking place. In addition to occupational stress, and we can see that as joint injuries, repetitive joint injuries, the jaw or the mandible on the top image here, the teeth, we see a remarkable type of feature, and our textbook refers to this as enamel hypoplasia. This is an arrest line. That's what we're seeing, those lines that are running along the teeth. The normal growth pattern of a human, it's not like a tree. Trees grow and then they go into a period of dormancy, and we see those lines if we cut a tree trunk in half. In contrast, when we see these types of arrest lines, either in long bones or on the teeth, in the case of enamel hypoplasia, that tells us that there's a nutritional stressor here. There's malnutrition. Something's going on. The same thing is true of the image below. That one is called parodic hyperostosis. Parodic hyperostosis, that spongy-like feature, I look at that and I always remember eating sponge toffee when I was a kid. It has that type of appearance. That tells us as well that there's a nutritional issue, a nutritional stress. This typically develops as a result of iron deficiency. So one of the things that was taking place during the Neolithic, as I pointed out, they were using grains. Now, one of the problems with grains is the difference between a leavened bread versus unleavened breads. Now, the first breads that people were producing, your flatbreads, they were not leavened. They didn't use yeast. The problem with unleavened bread is it's very high in phytic acid. And phytic acid pulls iron, it draws iron out of your body. So what we see in the archaeological record, prior to people figuring out how to leaven bread, and perhaps one of the more important inventions, if you're a beer drinker, is beer. That's a way of leavening grains. We see a lot of parodic hyperostosis, in other words, anemic conditions. This tells us that they were not that healthy. As discussed, the domestication of animals, it leads to that first epidemiological transition. So some of the first diseases that emerge, measles, for example, pertussis, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, the common cold, all of this stuff is traced to animals. Now, I'm going to work backwards, because I want to finish off with measles and pertussis. Jot this down. So influenza, this is a type of disease. It's a virus that we trace to birds and we trace to pigs. So as humans began to domesticate birds, as they began to domesticate pigs, this virus starts to become a problem. As for smallpox, smallpox is traced to the domestication of cattle, cows. So as we keep cows, this disease spills over and it begins to infect us. And it's not until the late 1970s that smallpox is finally eradicated through a very aggressive vaccination campaign. Took a long time to get rid of that one. In addition, tuberculosis, this is a type of bacterium, and it's also traced to cows as well. So the very first instances of tuberculosis would have come from a bacteria called Mycobacterium bovinus. And this, in all likelihood, was transmitted through milk. As we were using that milk, as we began to turn it into yogurts and cheese, and we weren't drinking it. We didn't start drinking milk until about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. At 6,000 years ago, at the very latest, I'm being generous there. So tuberculosis, we want to be able to trace that to cows. As for pertussis and measles, this is a difficult one. I love dogs. They're perhaps one of the first animals that we domesticated, and maybe they even domesticated us. They just began to hang out in our villages. We gave them some scraps. They didn't go away, and we developed this great relationship that they kept away other animals. They hunted some of the rodents, and in the end, they become humankind's best friend, I guess, unless you're a cat lover, and we can say that, yeah, they can be one of our best friends as well. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about keeping animals, or what's referred to as animal husbandry. In the same way that, for example, when individuals began to collect grains, let's draw some grains up at the top, some wheat, sheaf of wheat to represent that, and they started to collect a lot of it. They needed somewhere to put that stuff, and that facilitated the emergence and the invention of pottery, some form of a storage container. What individuals were doing at this point of time is nothing less than resource management. First time this was really beginning to take place. With respect to animal husbandry, when we started to keep animals, we were also engaging in resource management. And with that resource management, we get the first epidemiological transition. Now, this isn't to say that we didn't have issues with meat in the past. For example, we said 2.5 million years ago, we see the emergence of the so-called paleo diet. And really what that represents is the introduction of meat to the human diet. And with the introduction of meat, we get a whole slew of parasites and other infections, parasites, etc. We've talked about that, so I'm going to leave it there. When we kept animals, we ultimately changed the relationship between us and them. So, for example, let's say we have an infected animal here, okay, and we have a group of individuals living in a small village, foragers, for example, and then a good distance away, we might have another small little village emerging, or some people, an encampment at this point of time. They're not engaged in that sedentary life. Now, these individuals, they go off and they hunt a couple of the individuals, and they're responsible for killing that animal, and in doing so, they come into contact with a potential, let's say, a virus. And let's say that this is a fairly virulent or deadly virus. Now, those individuals that were in contact with it, they're now infected. And when they bring that meat back to their encampment, anybody who's in contact with it is going to get infected as well. Now, the thing to imagine, if this is a virus that's highly virulent, it's going to wipe everybody out in this village. Now, the likelihood of, say, one of these individuals, and we've talked about this, briefly already, and we'll come back to it in a minute when we're looking at population size. If one of these individuals tried to make it to another village and they were really sick, or they were just walking around and they had high fever, they have diarrhea, butt cheeks clenched, the likelihood is they're not going to be able to reach those individuals, and thus the last infected individual here and the virus that has spilled over to a human population, so we have the virus, and, for example, the last infected human in that village, they both die out, thus not infecting these individuals. But with animal husbandry, we've changed the relationship. What ends up happening, rather than having small groups of individuals living in bands, population, right, it's increased. And it's this population increase that allows for disease to become endemic. So in the past, there were certainly epidemics, and this is this first model that we're looking at up top. Certainly this is an outbreak of disease, and we'd say that it's an epi or a localized outbreak of disease that affects one group of people and doesn't go on to affect another group of individuals. So one of the things that we do need to point out here is it's that a close association between animals and humans that facilitate spillover events. Now, when did this begin to take place? So another question here, and it's always great to ask these questions. When did domestication, husbandry, and associated spillover events occur? Because ultimately we're talking about that first epidemiological transition. Sorry, spelling. So our first epidemiological transition. When do we see evidence for that beginning? Because that's ultimately when we have infectious disease as the major cause of human mortality and morbidity. What I want to point out is looking at some of the archaeological evidence, we're able to gain insight into when all of this began. And not only are we looking at archaeological, but we're looking at that bioarchaeological, or what we often refer to as zooarchaeology. Okay, zooarchaeology. And I'm going to take you here to the Fertile Crescent, to an area that we refer to as the Zagros Mountains. I'm going to highlight it in red in our top right corner. So here are the Zagros Mountains. And what we see in the Zagros Mountains is first evidence for sheep domestication. Okay, so there we have sheep domestication, and we're seeing this around 11,000 YBP in that Zagros. Our textbook refers to this, Zagros Mountains, in an area referred to as Al-Kosh. Now, what we see there is prior to, let's say before, $11,000 years ago. Let's go on the other side, and we can make after. We're seeing a change in people's behavior with respect to the way that they're managing resources. So before 11,000 years ago, what we see is they're killing sheep. They're killing the animals that are in that area for subsistence. They're hunting, and fairly equal distribution of males and females. So in other words, they're going out and they're hunting whatever they find, and they're killing them. After 11,000 years, we do not see an equal distribution of males and females. Instead, what we see is an increase in the males that are being slaughtered. And why is that? What's ended up happening here is they've begun to understand that males, draw that line back in, that males are not as valuable as females. In other words, you can have a couple of males. Let's use the sign for Mars. Okay, there's our males. And you can have a number of females. And these males can inseminate those females. You only need a few. And if resources are slim, well, here, let's go over here and say, well, let's eat this one here. And we can still inseminate all those females. We're hungry. Let's go back here and let's eat that one there. And we can still inseminate those females. And those females are going to go on to reproduce. And your resources continue in time. So as pointed out, this is pretty important when we look at sites like Al-Kash, because what we're seeing is the emergence of resource management. I'm going to highlight that there. So we're seeing resource management in Al-Kash, and that's taking place at around 11,000 years before the present. Now, what that allows us to do is say, well, here is that moment where we're on the threshold of the emergence of the First Epidemiological Transition. And as you can see here, there's a number of factors that are involved. It's not just animals. We need to see population size increase. We need to move from small encampments to villages, to towns, and eventually cities where disease remains there indefinitely. There's always a new host. You're not getting a particular virus wiping out the only group that's around, plus itself in that process. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So with the emergence of domestication, then we start to see these new diseases emerge in that Neolithic revolution. So we can call Neolithic diseases, or the diseases that emerged during that Neolithic revolution. And this is the first time this has ever happened. And from that Neolithic revolution, those Neolithic diseases, we get that first epidemiological transition. And we get the pathogen pools that continue to exist today. As pointed out, there are 4,000, approximately 1,415 diseases that affect humans. And to be clear, how many of those are zoonotic? Okay, deriving from zoons in Greek, or animals. %61. So what types of diseases emerge at this point of time? A couple examples. So I had talked about domesticating animals, ungulates, hooved animals. Let's take a look at cattle, for example. When we domesticated cattle, they provided that spillover event, and perhaps a couple of other animals here involved as well, maybe a natural reservoir such as a rodent, but we have the spillover of what's referred to as tuberculosis, or TB. Now, tuberculosis didn't emerge in the way that it exists today. When we look at tuberculosis today, It's caused by something that's referred to as Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's not the way it initially evolved. So from cattle, the spillover event would have been Mycobacterium bovinus. And eventually that Mycobacterium bovinus, which is a bacterium, it mutated into the form that we call Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it mutates into Mycobacterium tuberculosis, such that today, approximately 2 billion people are infected. About 10% of those individuals have active TB, but nonetheless, we can see what's happened during this Neolithic transition, this first epidemiological transition during the Neolithic, with respect to keeping cattle or engaging in that. Let's move to the next slide and take a look at, no, actually I have some space here. In addition to tuberculosis, so that's one of the diseases that we should be able to associate with cattle, Mycobacterium bovinus and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Oh, and I forgot to note here, this ultimately, would have been a result of coming into contact with milk. You can still pick up Mycobacterium bovinus through milk and fluids. And as pointed out, it mutates into Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The other disease that emerges in addition to tuberculosis from cattle, we just talked about this on the last slide, is smallpox. Smallpox probably spilled over first from rodent populations, and that would have been, again, with keeping food and resources, that brings rodents. So as populations increase and we have poor sanitation, we're going to get rodents. That spills over to cattle. And from cattle, eventually it spills over to humans. So smallpox, it's a virus. You should be familiar with this already. I'm just going to review. It's a virus, and it's caused by variola. A number of different species. So it belongs to the variola genus. And then we get variola minor, right up here, in addition to that major. So variola minor, variola major, and variola intermedius. I can't believe I'm going to fit this in here. Intermedius. So variola minor, variola major, variola intermedius. Major, that's the worst one to contract. Intermedius, it's just that. It's an intermediate one. Minor, this is pretty interesting because in Turkey, people had recognized that there were weaker forms of smallpox, and they'd have what was referred to as smallpox parties. And the kids would get infected with a weaker strain, and that would provide them with immunity. And if you're wondering, and I'm just going to take us back a second here, how do we know that smallpox comes from cattle? Well, it was Edward Jenner. This is starting to look like my old classroom here. A nice big blackboard with all kinds of writing going everywhere on it. It's beautiful. Edward Jenner had recognized or had discovered that cowpox provided immunity he discovered that cowpox, let me just draw this up here, barrier, no, it's not going to work. He discovered that smallpox provided that immunity to smallpox. And in doing so, we know that they're related if it's that close genetically. Okay, let's move on and take a look at one more disease, perhaps. Maybe two. We'll see what happens. So I want to take a brief look here at Bordetella pertussis, kennel cough to the whooping cough. This is a childhood disease among humans, whooping cough, but it's in fact traced to dogs, and it goes fairly early into our history. So here we're looking at some Mesopotamian sculptures, a stele, where we clearly see that dogs have been domesticated, they're being used. And with that domestication and that close relationship that we began to develop physically with dogs, not just emotionally, that provided opportunities for Bordetella pertussis to spill over to human populations. So a few facts here. Kennel cough, it's caused by Bordetella brontoceptia, and that's something that's transmitted between dogs. So if you get a new dog, they say, don't introduce it to other dogs until it's had its shot. The reason is they can transmit Bordetella brontocepta between each other, or the kennel cough. There's a single mutation event, according to geneticists, evolutionary biologists, that was responsible for creating Bordetella pertussis. Now, this is what impacts us. So when we look at pertussis or whooping cough, which we're vaccinated for when we're young, the origins, they're likely associated with the domestication of dogs. And that doesn't mean it originated in them. That's as far as back that we've been able to go. In all likelihood, it's probably traced to rodents. When it comes to disease, bats, rodents, that's where some of the worst ones have emerged and moved to other species, and then they eventually move to us. So I think that's where we're going to leave it now. Make sure that you've taken a look at your material that I've assigned, any videos, and get prepared for our module test. Take care. So I'm not going to belabor any point here and continue. I think you're getting the idea of the impact of domestication of animals, and I'm just going to, for the sake of our tests, outline a few things that I would remember. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I wrote the test, so here we go. Cattle. So from that, we get the emergence of smallpox. And we've talked about tuberculosis. Okay, so two diseases that we should remember for our test. In addition, we had just talked about canines, or what we call dogs, and we get pertussis. Or the whooping cough, and something we've referred to already, measles. In addition to dogs and cattle, we also began to domesticate pigs, and from pigs we can get a number of worms. Trichinosis, particularly scary. This can affect any system in your body, destroy muscle, nervous system. In addition to trichinosis, tapeworms, so Tinea solium, right? Tinea solium, that's responsible for tapeworms, which really, the tapeworm's not that bad. Lots of people, I think nearly 2 billion people live with tapeworms on a regular basis, and it doesn't cause any serious illness. Not that I'm saying we want a tapeworm. So trichinosis, tapeworms, influenza. We can move on to birds, began to keep birds and reptiles and whatnot. And from there, we also see influenza, call it bird flu sometimes. In addition to influenza, we also see salmonella, and the list goes on. So at least a couple of there. How about horses? The rhinovirus. So the other thing that I do want to point out, it's not always the fact that the cattle, the dogs, the pigs, the birds are the reservoirs. We also have to remember that there's a natural reservoir. And intermediate hosts, and then us. So these animals that we're keeping as well, they might function as intermediate hosts, and when we begin to disrupt the ecologies or the homeostasis, okay, disrupt that homeostasis, that's often when we see those spillover events. Okay, let's move along. So we've got a couple of elements here that we've looked at, and I want to take a look at farming when we started to grow our own crops or we began to engage in cultivation. Right, so we're starting to grow our own crops, and in doing so, we're augmenting the ecosystem or the environment. I'm going to give you an example here of something that's referred to. I'll go to the right of this. Something that we refer to as swidden or milpa. This is discussed in your textbook. It's called slash and burn farming, or a slash and burn technology in conjunction with shifting cultivation. So as we began to augment the environment, and one of the first ways that individuals began to augment that environment is they realized that you didn't need to move anymore. In contrast, you could stay in one place. You got our villages here, our early villages, clay hut, and they can farm in a particular area. So let's say they decide to farm right here. They begin to grow their crops. The problem with growing crops in one space, and if anybody has a garden at home, eventually the area that we're growing in is depleted of nutrients, and you need to add fertilizer. Now, at this time, they could go to the store and buy fertilizer. Eventually, people realize you can have fertilizer. And you know what works really well? Human feces or human poop. And that, let's back arrow here, you can imagine you're going to get diseases associated with human excrement and shedding various viruses and bacteria in human feces. So that's number one problem. The second problem is with that depleted resources, or the depleted nutrients, I should say, you need to shift your cultivation. So you shift to another location. So you move your cultivation and you let this area lie fallow. Okay, so in our number 1 cultivating spot, we've moved to number 2 up here, and we engage in slash and burn. So that's swidden, and what that does is ultimately is we have all this growth, the trees that are perhaps in this area, and we're going to cut those down. The nutrients, they go into the soil, and it becomes quite fertile for a period of time. And then you need to let it lie again fallow, or it needs to rest. And in the meantime, you go over and you shift to a new plot. And like I said, this really does allow individuals to stay in one place. You engage in that swidden, that slash and burn, and resources in. And then again, when this is depleted, ideally what's happened here is this area that was lying fallow is rested long enough that nitrogen, for example, has worked its way in from rotting vegetation on the sides, and we have growth of new plant life in this area. Those are my plants. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in swidden. I'm going to cut that stuff down. And in cutting that down, I'm adding more nutrients to the soil. And I can farm there. And then eventually that cycle continues. The problem with this is when an area is lying fallow, there's little divots and pockets. I'll just, a little arrow here. We see these divots perhaps and pockets that water pools in. And what likes to breed in these little pockets of water? Mosquitoes. So with shifting cultivation, we see an increase, and we had pointed out that malaria was always around, but now we're having an increased incidence of malaria in populations associated with swidden and this shifting cultivation. Okay, let's move to one more slide and I'll give you one more example. So the last thing I want to point out here is with respect to cultivation is a process that we have discussed already, and I'm just going to briefly review. And we had noted that prior to the invention of agriculture, people lived in the mountains of the Fertile Crescent. Okay, some review, it's nice. So in the mountains of the Fertile Crescent, and then along came a mini ice age called the Younger Dryas, and that forced people such as the Natufians, it forced those people into lower valleys. Into the lower valleys. And as people moved into the lower valleys, we had pointed out what they were looking for was water. And when they found streams, what they did with that water is they trained it. Now, what do I mean by training water? They trained water. In other words, they did so through irrigation. No, I got an error there. Let's erase that. They did so through irrigation, ditches. And they had invented at that point of time, we had talked about through training water through those irrigation ditches, they invented floodplain irrigation or farming. And this was great because Now farming was there, the Younger Dryas, it had come to an end, and farming emerges. Now, there's a problem with floodplain irrigation, and we had just looked at this idea of Swidden and Milpa and that shifting cultivation. With floodplain irrigation, let's go up here, floodplain. With that floodplain irrigation, we've got a problem of stagnant water. And that stagnant water is a great breeding area for example, mosquitoes. But the other thing that we have there in a lot of these areas where, for example, we have rice paddy farming, or if you're in areas of Egypt around the Nile, they talk about something called bulzaria. Bulzaria is caused by a particular type of schistosome. Schistosome, and particularly schistosome mansoni. This is something that causes schistosomiasis. Okay, schistosomiasis. And the cycle, and I believe we've already discussed it, there's an intermediate species. So ultimately you have humans in areas where there's a lot of snails living in this stagnant water, and then again back to humans. So the snails are a type of intermediate species. Humans, they shed, sounds terrible, they shed eggs in their excreta, or their urine. So as I pointed out, when people also began to use human feces or human poop as fertilizer, you have a problem, because now they're excreting into farming. Okay, so you got that issue with human feces or poop as a fertilizer. So the humans, they shed the eggs, and now those eggs, they infect the snails. There's a certain life cycle here I'm talking about, and then it continues to develop in the snails and eventually exits. The snail is what's referred to as a fluke, kind of a free-floating animal, and infects humans, and schistosomiasis develops. One of the things that schistosomiasis can lead to, and we're looking at the emergence of different diseases, it can lead to cancer as well. So this is another possibility of disease emerging at this time as a result of, ultimately, what this technology that appeared to work for us fairly well and help us farming. In the end, I want to point out that we disrupted that ecological balance. This was a result of human behavior. And I've come back to the idea a few times, and I've pointed out that disease is just as much cultural as it is biological. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So in addition to becoming farmers and keeping animals and engaging in resource management, and that leading to one of the aspects that drives this epidemiological transition, the first one, we also see changes in the way that people live sedentary life. When we talk about sedentary life, what we're referring to is permanent villages or towns. We'll just say villages here. Okay, so we see permanent villages. And with permanent villages and resource management, let's spell that right. Okay, sorry. With permanent villages and resource management, populations eventually begin to increase, and we start to engage in, for example, trade. Now, a couple of concepts I want to remind you about. We had talked about an epidemic. We had talked about a pandemic. And we had talked about disease becoming endemic. And these are important concepts here. So, epidemic, we want to say that this is localized. It's a localized outbreak. Pandemic, in the way that we use it today, it means all. So it means world-wide outbreak. And endemic means within. I'd like to mispronounce that, at least when I was in school, and I'd pronounce endemic. So it's within populations, and it just doesn't go away. So the other thing that I want to come back to here is we had talked about the R naught value, and that plays a role in shaping disease and the first epidemiological transition. So a couple of examples. COVID-19 has an R naught of approximately 4.5. It's infectious. It's more infectious than H1N1 and the seasonal flu. It certainly is not as infectious as measles, which has a very high rate of reproduction or reproductive value there. Now, the other factor we need to take into consideration is how virulent a particular or deadly a particular virus is, for example. So when we take a look at, let's say, measles isn't particularly deadly. It can cause a lot of damage. It's not particularly deadly. And in contrast to measles, Ebola has a fairly low reproductive value. Approximately 1.5 is the reproductive value there. So it's much more difficult to contract. However, Ebola is highly virulent. Do an arrow for highly. Highly virulent, and especially back in 1976 when the fatality or the mortality rate was about 80%. So 80% of the individuals that contracted it died. Now, the other thing that we need to take into consideration here as well, let's go off to the other side, when populations are small and you know they're not closely clustered together. They're not closely clustered together. What ends up happening here is individuals, they will become infected. If it's highly virulent, those individuals, unfortunately, we're going to see high fatality rates, and they're going to die off. When societies become large, and that's what's happening with the invention of farming, societies are starting to become quite large. Not only are they large in themselves, but those towns and cities, they're clustered, right? So we get a city here, for example, and a city right over here, say along the Tigris River. So this is the Tigris River, and we're seeing these villages pop up pretty much in the same area. And what else is happening is they're starting to engage in trade. So when we have small clustered groups of individuals, we certainly see epidemics. There's no question about that. In small communities, traditionally hunting and gathering societies, you're not going to have a pandemic. That's not going to emerge. Pandemics emerge in these large societies. So the pandemic, it's emerging in a large society that's in contact with other societies, trading, for example, and they have the ability to spread disease. Doesn't make a difference where it emerges. They have that ability to constantly spread disease. So in addition to it being a pandemic, when you have fresh new hosts, individuals, for example, some are going to die, some individuals are going to survive. They may carry the virus. Some of them may be asymptomatic and it might not affect them. They're going to see the emergence of endemic disease, and it's always within a population. It's constantly circulating. And we do have very specific numbers for some of these. For example, measles, and I'll briefly point this out here. Measles, I think I've referred to it, but it was studied by Black, and he pointed out that for measles to become a regular problem for humans, you need to have about 400,000 individuals, and then it can regularly circulate between them. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So I'm going to come to a back in the days where we're in class. I used to play a game with students to help them understand how population size and disease functions. So here, what I say is to the students is you can use black and red squares, and you want to be able to use 4 moves or less, and you want to try to jump all of the individuals in your group, and if you do so, after every individual you've jumped, you get to move on. And what that's meant to demonstrate is that process of infection. So for example, I'm going to say up here, this is going to be me, and I'm infected with a virus, so I can move 4, 1, 2, 3. I've infected this individual, and now I can move again. So 1, 2. I've infected somebody else. So here we're saying that we have something that's fairly high, like measles, and again I can move, and you can see that we're really close here, so I'm able to cover this quite quickly. And this is, as pointed out, something, let's say we have an R value that's fairly high here, or perhaps even higher, so that R naught value is quite high. As for moving on, because we're living in other areas, the question is, can I move on another 4 squares? So I've infected everybody in my group. Can I move on 4 more squares to reach, for example, the blue group? So for example, let's say I move here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what this represents is distance. I'm not able to reach this group of individuals. Perhaps they're moving at the same time if we wanted to extend this, and maybe they're moving as well, and we come into contact with each other. But generally speaking, we're not seeing that type of process until we get the emergence of trade. So we're going to say we're great distances here, we're not trading with each other, and we're not going to infect the blue group with the virus. Let's move to the next slide and see what happens when populations begin to increase in size. So here we're seeing that the red group has increased in size. Its population has increased actually quite drastically. And moving on to the next group, so any one of these individuals that becomes infected, within 4 squares, 1, 2, 3, infect somebody else in my group, and another 4 I get because I've infected, so I can infect this person, and now I can continue to move the virus through all of these individuals, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm hitting absolutely everybody with this virus. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 there. Now the problem is, can I reach the next group? So let's say here I try. 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm not going to reach there. So I think you're getting the idea. As populations begin to increase, we have a greater chance of infecting other individuals. Now, as populations continue to increase and as we start to trade with each other, we're going to see a very different situation on the next slide. And I think it's much more representative of the world that we live in today. Let's go to the next slide. So here we see that populations have increased drastically, and not only have populations increased drastically in size, we can write a few points down here. So we see massive increases in population. So we definitely have increased population. Not only do we have increased population, but we also have regular trade. And with those two factors, that leads to constant exposure. And you have to imagine, back 10,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, individuals didn't have PPE, they didn't have germ theory, that doesn't exist. So not only are they engaged in constant exposure, but depending upon that R value, we're seeing very high infections. So let's say high infections. And I'm going to go over to the other side. New people, babies, they're always being born. It's always increasing. And that translates in an epidemiological model to a new host. And if there's always a new host, the disease becomes endemic. And ultimately, it doesn't go away. It remains, I'm going to say within, short form there, the population. And I think, reflecting on what's going on today, a lot of individuals, as we know, have tried to think about maybe we should take a herd immunity approach. The UK initially started with that type of idea, the herd immunity. And if we go back and we look at, for example, what remained within the populations, smallpox emerges fairly early, for example. Okay, so smallpox, it's traced to cattle. So when we started to domesticate cattle and keep cattle, smallpox emerges. And it wasn't until 1979 that smallpox was finally eradicated. Thousands and thousands of years. The herd immunity did not work with smallpox. And to really be clear about this, probably no disease in the history of humankind has killed as many people as smallpox. And this is a result of human populations increasing in size and there always being an individual to contract that smallpox virus. Let's move on. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it. Unfortunately, if I created videos with myself down here in the bottom window, right down here in the bottom window, it just takes up too much memory and I wouldn't be able to deliver these slides with ease to you. So that's where we're going to leave it. And I have to say I've had fun with this blackboard here. This makes me feel a little more normal, like we've kind of returned to the way things should be. The last thing I want to make sure that you take a look at before I take off and make sure that you've done your readings, but also the role that unleavened bread plays in human health as well. And I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas. Unleavened bread, it's high in something called phytic acid. And phytic acid forms an insoluble bond to Fe or iron. And that bond is responsible for pulling iron or depleting iron in our bodies, and it creates something called iron deficiency. So this is another issue, and we've talked about a number of the problems that emerge with the Neolithic revolution, and some of them are related to cultivation, some of them are related to the domestication of animals, population size, beginning to live in filth, but also our diet as well. So one of the great inventions eventually, it was leavened bread. And believe it or not, leavened bread perhaps first comes in the form of a liquid meal, and this was invented in Mesopotamia, and it's beer. Okay, I don't like beer. No, I shouldn't say that. I like beer. I don't drink beer. The glutens, they just don't work well for me. So I keep it to Scotch, limited glutens there. How do we know this in the archaeological record? Hopefully we'll see if I can get some of this, and I normally would pass this around. There you can see it, okay? That kind of spongy feature, those little holes you see on the skull here, that's called parodic hyperostosis. And that parodic hyperostosis tells us that the individual is suffering from, in this case, quite a severe iron deficiency or an anemic condition. Okay, we'll leave it there. Can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, have a great one. Cheers.